All right, let's go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 23 this morning as we continue a sermon series that we began before Easter, and we are going to finish it up in the next few weeks here. But we're going to turn to Luke 23, verses 50 through 56. I hear some pages turning, so I'm going to wait just another second. All right. Now there was a man named Joseph, a member of the council, a good and upright man who had not consented to their decision and action. He came from a Judean town of Arimathea, and he was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. But they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. We are, as I said, continuing through our sermon series here. We began a few weeks ago, and it's I named it that lovely German word there, Zeitgeist, which if you've forgotten what that means, it just means spirit of the age is one way it's translated. And it's a way of talking about kind of the day and time we're in. What is going on in today's time that we need to be aware of, and especially for us as followers of Jesus, what is God calling us to do and to be in this time, to remain faithful disciples of Jesus. As Jesus himself said on multiple occasions, we need to know how to interpret the times in order that we might rise to be faithful disciples today. And just a reminder, walking back through the series briefly, we talked about how in the first week that we need to be a people of prayer and focus in an age of endless distractions and entertainment options, that in today's time especially, perhaps more than any other, it's so easy to have our minds and our hearts drawn away from God and onto other things. And God is calling us once again to be a people of prayer and focus. We talked about how God is calling us to be a people of holiness in an age of moral confusion. How in today's time it seems that we have shifted from seeing God as the source of truth and more looking at ourselves and deciding for ourselves what is right and wrong, good and evil, and how God is urging us back to be a people of holiness, to be obedient to what the vision of life God has given us and to be faithful to it. We talked about how God is calling us to be a people of generosity in a time of scarcity, about how in today's time we live with this kind of fear all around us. Is there going to be enough? Will we have enough? And God is calling us to be people who trust Him in the midst of our fear. And then shortly before Easter, we talked about how we are called to be a people of self-denial in an age of self-fulfillment. In a time when we're always looking at how we can work on our self-improvement or have the Instagram perfect life or have it all, Jesus invites us to see that the way to true life is to die to ourselves and to be a people who live for God and not for ourselves. And so today, we're going to be talking about being a people or a community of rest in an age of exhaustion. Fair warning, I may be working out some of my own issues publicly here this morning. I don't know if it's like the post-Holy Week, going kind of thing, but I was like, "Ooh, Lord, I may be getting a little personal here because this is what I feel so often." And maybe it's not just the post-Holy Week issues. Maybe it's also because I'm working out the issues that happen in the Tucker household. I've joked before that Katie and I have very different understandings of what a vacation looks like. If y'all remember, a few years ago, I took a week off from work here, really excited about it. And that was the week that Katie was like, "Oh, I'm so glad we're off this week. Can you build a fence in the backyard?" And I was like, wait, this is vacation, right? And so I proceeded to spend the entire week jackhammering solid rock in the backyard. I came back to work, as they say, to rest from my vacation, quite literally. right? We live in a time of exhaustion in the Tucker household sometimes. But it's not just me, and I don't think it's just you either. I think it's a characteristic of our age. There's a few reasons why I say this. I think, first of all, I think most of us kind of operate on this kind of unconscious theology of progress. And what I mean by that is we kind of live with this idea that tomorrow will be better than today, right? That tomorrow will be better than today. And what this looks like is if we could just get to the next thing, right? If we could just make it to that next vacation we have scheduled. If we could just wait till we get that next project finished, or get that through that next busy season in our life, or if we can get that next room cleaned, or whatever it may be, if we could just get to the next thing, then we'll finally be able to rest, right? And so we work really hard to get to that next thing, and guess what we find when we get there? There's just one more next thing, right? Tomorrow never seems to arrive the way we think and plan it might be. I don't think I'm alone in that. I think also it's a result, our culture of exhaustion is a result of what we value at the same time. We tend to value money over time, at least to a certain point in our life. We value productivity more than rest, right? People will ask you all the time, how many hours did you work this week, right? Or we think to ourselves, how many hours did I put in this week? You know what people never ask you? How many hours did you rest this week? We never hear that. No one ever asks that question. How many hours did you take off this week? And if we do hear that, we probably feel a little shame behind it if we took off more than we think we should, right? We value productivity far more than rest. And at the same time, we also associate our identity with activity, right? Our identity with our activity. We live in a time of side hustles, of constant pressure towards improving ourselves and toward not missing out on anything. How many of us, I think I've said it at least once or twice this morning, our standard response when people ask us how we're doing is, busy. Been busy, right? I had a lot going on. It's been busy. You know what we never say? I've just had nothing going on. I've just been taking it easy. It's just not happening. I never hear that when I ask people. In fact, I think we wouldn't want to say that because I think sometimes we associate busyness and activity with living a life that's full of meaning. And when we stop and we say, I hadn't had a lot going on, it might make us feel like, ooh, am I doing enough? Am I being enough? Am I involved enough? All this to say, in this kind of environment that we live in, it leads to this kind of, it leads to exhaustion, first of all, which if we're not careful can then lead us to burnout. I heard a pastor, Dave Lomas, who preached an awesome sermon around this topic, which I would love to post and have you all listen to that. I've gotten a lot of ideas from it, but he talks about burnout is doing more than your soul has the capacity to handle. Doing more than your soul has the capacity to handle. When we're experiencing burnout and exhaustion, the effects on us are plain to see for most of us. It leads to a loss of emotional self-awareness, right? A loss of emotional self-awareness. How many times have you been with somebody and you just felt like they lashed out on you for no reason? Like the response was way more than whatever happened was worth it, right? That might be a sign that they're feeling burned out. At the end of a long week, my patience has gone from pretty good, I feel like most of the time, to very, very low. And when you're burned out, sometimes you can lose sight of kind of your emotional self-awareness, how you're actually doing. It can lead to a whole lot of cynicism. When I do most of my complaining, it's not at the start of a week after I've had a lot of rest and I've slept really good and I don't have a lot going on. I don't do a lot of complaining at that point. When I do most of my complaining is when I'm tired and overworked and have a ton going on. Then it just seems like I see all the problems in the world and not any of the good things. If you're someone that struggles with being a person who complains a lot, maybe think about, are you feeling burnout because you are overworked and you don't know how to rest? And if we continue it can lead to kind of some mental breaks, a rise in anxiety as we are seeing all around us, and so many other things. But the good news is that in the midst of all of this, in the midst of this kind of culture that we're in, the good news for the tired and weary soul is that God seems to value rest and offer rest abundantly, right? God seems to value rest so much more than we do. We see it throughout all of Scripture. If we go back to the very beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3, once again we read, "On the sixth day, God finished the work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from all the work He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work He had done in creation." If you stop and think about it, when God created Adam and Eve on day 6, according to the poem there in Genesis, that would have meant that Adam and Eve's first day of life would have been on the Sabbath day. That God created them for their first full day of life. God created them on the sixth day. Their very first day of life would have been a day of rest. As the old saying goes, they worked from rest, not for rest. God wove it in from the beginning that rest would be one of the very first things that we value as His people. But as we see in the Scriptures, this didn't last too long, right? We see there in Genesis 3, after the fall, God is speaking about some of the effects. And He writes, and we read in verses 18 and 19, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. You shall eat of the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return from the ground." When the writer of Genesis is talking about the toiling of Adam there, he's not just talking about work that comes from a good hard day of work. He's talking about a couple of other things, especially the elusiveness of rest that we seek. Because there's a couple different kinds of rest, right? There's the rest that we need from our routine labor, from a long a week of work, when we realize we're finite, limited creatures, when we can only go so far and only do so much, and energy drinks and coffee and all that will only get us so far. But there's another kind of rest, a rest for our souls that the Bible talks so much about. A rest that's characterized from restlessness and wandering, a rest that's characterized as letting our guard down from enemy threats all around us. It's a rest that's characterized by releasing the tension and the fear and the worry that we carry, of living in the present and not hoping that our rest will come in tomorrow. It's a kind of rest where we release all those lingering details of life that we struggle to let go of because we haven't figured out how they're all going to work out yet, right? We all carry those things in our minds and our hearts where we just can't seem to let go because we're just not sure yet how they're all going to work out. They're the reasons why we keep on working, right? Because we struggle to trust. Will God provide if I actually take a break here? Will God keep me from this fear of failure that I have if I actually take a break? Or that pressure that we feel on our shoulders. This rest for our soul is giving ourselves permission to still be in progress as people, right? To still be in progress, to have not yet been totally healed of all the sin that we have in our life, but trust that God is still going to work it out of us. To trust that all these things in life that we wish were better about ourselves, that God is still at work in us. And we don't have to solve everything today, but God is with us for the long haul. And I think this rest for the soul can apply to us whether we work 55 hours a week or whether we are retired. It's these two great needs for rest I think is why God is so serious about the Sabbath rest we see in the Scriptures. We could do a whole series on the Sabbath, but just a reminder, in Exodus 20, God talks about the Sabbath, and we read there, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slaves, your livestock, the alien residents in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Isn't it wild that in this, which is a part of the Ten Commandments, as we know, isn't it wild that in the same Ten Commandments where it says, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery, that God put a commandment to rest on equal footing as all of those things? I guarantee none of us consider the command to rest on equal footing as not to murder. And yet it is right there in the Ten Commandments. Isn't it interesting, too, that God, it says in that one specifically, remember the Sabbath. It's as if God knows we will forget about it. And again, it's for all people there. There's no essential versus non-essential workers, as we read in that passage. It's for everyone, and it's rooted in the invitation to be like God. We read in Deuteronomy, God repeats it, the command to rest, to a new generation, but he adds a different layer of meaning to it at the end. In verse 15 of Deuteronomy 5, he says, remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. God says it is rooted in your identity as a free people and as someone who is no longer a slave. Do not work, but rest. Now, we're not in that same context, obviously, but all of us have these inner pharaohs in our minds, do we not? These inner voices that say, you got to keep on going. You got to keep on doing. You've not done enough. Keep on trying. You are not enough. Keep on going. We all have this inner voice of Pharaoh urging us to constantly do more. It's why the people of God, even though they entered into the promised land, they still struggled to find that rest. And as we get to the New Testament, as we see Jesus there, he comes as one being the Lord of the Sabbath, bringing rest with him. Remember Jesus' words to us, come to me, all you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's interesting that Jesus did so many healings on the Sabbath, right? And people got so upset at him for that, but he tended to do so many of his healings on the Sabbath day. And I think he did that because he was trying to emphasize and point out this greater rest that's available to us through Christ. And he reminds us, as he says, that the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. And finally, in Hebrews, we read in chapter 4, the writer of Hebrews says this, so then, a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. For those who enter God's rest also rest from their labors, as God did from his. Therefore, let us therefore make every effort to enter into that rest, so that no one may fall through such disobedience as theirs. He says there's a rest available if we will remember it, and I love this, if we will make every effort to enter into it. Isn't it ironic that the writer says, make every effort to enter into rest? Because anyone that's tried to take a true Sabbath rest, anyone that wants to rest knows that it takes effort. As we come to our Easter scenes this week, I want to point out just two things. If we don't Sabbath, if we don't live into the Sabbath rest, and I think once again God built the Sabbath in so that we would have an opportunity to actually practically live out the rest that Jesus is talking us, Sabbath will get us. If we don't Sabbath, eventually we'll find ourselves being unable to go forward. And we see this with this beautiful picture in the disciples, of the disciples in the garden, right? Jesus tells them when he's in the garden, stay with me and keep watch. But what do we find them doing? Fast asleep. Fast asleep, exhausted, tension-riddled, unable to do what He asks. So many of us, it's not because we don't know what God is calling us to do. It's not because He hasn't spoken to us. It's because we don't have the capacity in our lives to be obedient. Because we're so busy and we're so unable to be obedient because we simply lack the capacity, the mental and emotional ability to say yes to God when He calls us to something. And that's why we need to rest. Because I want to be someone that is able to respond when God calls. And I don't want to give the leftovers to the people that matter most to me. My fear sometimes is that through the very busyness of our weeks, that I give the leftovers of my energy to God and to Katie and to others, not the very first fruits. But God invites us once again into rest. So what does this look like, and what will it look like for you and for me? Once again, I want to encourage us. The practice of the Sabbath, it is something that I don't think is just for the Old Testament. I think it's something for all of us that God has woven into the fabric of creation. And just as a caveat, I'm still in process and living this out too, and building an intentional kind of Sabbath. But I do know a few things. A good Sabbath involves stopping. It involves stopping. We cease from our work on a Sabbath because, again, God ceased from His work. We cease from work not because the work is done, but because the work is never done, and because God calls us to rest at His invitation. Right? If you think you can only stop once the work is done, you're never going to take a Sabbath. So stop, not because the work is done, but because God invites you to rest. And as we stop, it always helps to do that with community. And when I say this, I mean a couple things. For once, I, for a long time, tried to take a Sabbath time, a real rest day, apart from Katie, apart from the person that I lived in my own home with. That was a terrible idea. Because, first of all, I would watch her working so diligently around the house, doing all kinds of things, while I sat there and tried to rest. That was not good for us, because I felt guilty the entire time and realized, no, who you live with, you have to do it as a family, as a group. It helps so much. So if you seek to do that, do it with those that you live with or the greater community around you, and know that it will be difficult. You can't just automatically turn that Pharaoh voice off in your mind. It's going to take practice. Pharaoh's voice will find you. Fight it. Fight it with God's voice that says, stop. But we don't just stop. We also, I think, are encouraged to step back on the Sabbath. And what I mean by this is I think a good Sabbath involves a whole lot of gratitude. I often, when I am seeking to do this, spend very intentional time practicing giving thanks to God. I do it through, oftentimes I go on a walk when I try to take Sabbath and just spout off all the things I'm thankful for on the walk. All the ways in which I'm tempted to complain, I want to bring that back and give thanks to God for it. A good Sabbath involves gratitude. And oftentimes we have conversations about what we have to be thankful for. It's also a great opportunity to reflect back on your week. Where have you seen God in the past week? What has God been up to? Where have you felt God close or absent? Where have you experienced the greatest joy or the greatest disappointment in your week? A good Sabbath, I think, allows us to regain our emotional kind of well-being as well as notice God again. Take time to not just stop, but to step back. And then finally, I just want to encourage you. A good Sabbath also involves stepping toward God and stepping toward others. I used to, when I would take time off, and I still struggle with this, sometimes time off for me would look like escaping. Like whatever I could do. I want to watch as many movies as possible. I want to do whatever I can to escape, to get as far away from this moment as I could. And I realized over time that might have a place, but really it's not about trying to leave your life. It's about trying to bring God more into your life. And so a good Sabbath for me involves reading a book that I've been putting off because I've been writing a sermon all week. Or it involves worship, what we're doing today. It involves listening to music. It involves going out into nature for me where I connect with God so well. It involves playing ball with your kids if that's what you have. Connecting with your family. It involves a lingering cup of coffee with your spouse. It involves a meal that's not on the go, but a meal where you can actually sit down to. One idea I saw was this idea of a Sabbath box. And so this one pastor, he talks about how he has this Sabbath box. And so every week when he gets ready to have a Sabbath, he puts everything in that box that he's going to need to Sabbath well. And so he puts his phone in there. He writes a to-do list of all the things that he didn't get done, and he puts it in the box and he leaves it there. He puts all the things that he needs that's going to keep him away from that moment in this box, and they put it up. And they bring out another box that for them have candles, that have all these things that allow him to be fully in that rest moment. Maybe that's an idea we need to put into practice here. But for whatever this looks like for you, maybe that's you're able to do a literal 24-hour day of rest, or maybe you can do a half day, or maybe it's a night. Whatever that looks like for you right now as we begin, I want to encourage you that in this age of exhaustion, God is encouraging us to rest. And that is what is so important. To end, I want to go back to our text that we read this morning. Did you notice what happened? I don't know if you thought, but there's a reason why they were pressing to get Jesus buried in the tomb so quickly, right? It says there that they wanted to bury Jesus on the day of preparation because the next day was a Sabbath. I think it's pretty telling that God in the very beginning of creation, after his work of creation was finished, that on the next day, the seventh day, God rested and declared it a holy day of rest. And then in the Easter story here, in the resurrection story, we see that when Jesus was on the cross, he cried out in his very last moments, declaring, "It is finished." And the next day, after he died, he lay still in the tomb, resting, so to speak, from his work of salvation. The next day was the day of resurrection. So what we see is that just as God rested after creation, Jesus rested after his work of salvation, and that the new creation was inaugurated on a brand new day of the week. It is God who gives us rest from sin through forgiveness, and it is God who promises to meet us in a place of rest if we will make every effort to meet God there. And when we take Sabbath, when we actually stop, when we actually say, Lord, even though I've got all these things undone, even though I'm worried about what's coming up, when we stop, I think we're declaring to ourselves and to the larger world around us that the promised rest has come through Jesus, and one day it will come in full again. And so my encouragement this week for all of us is may we take time to stop, to step back, and to step toward God and others as we become a people of rest in an age of exhaustion. Let's pray.